What is, I picked up something also in your article, what is the Global Compassionate Use Program? Because that's something new to me from the limb-girdle perspective. I only know about the clinical trials that you can take part in, but this seems to be something different. What is this?
Well, it was an accidental turn of phrase that I think is actually very revealing. And I actually, so what happened was this press release came out with respect to the Roche treatment, Evrysdi, which is the one treatment of the three that is now being registered in South Africa. But this was about 2.5 years ago, or 2 years ago. This press release came out from one of the NGOs, the SMA NGOs in the UK. And they announced in the press release that Roche was launching a global compassionate use program that would see people who didn't have access to Evrysdi given the treatment for free until such time as access paths were established. So that caused a huge amount of excitement here because the phrase global compassionate use implies global, right? And then 2 years went by and people started trying to access this treatment and no one could. And what we eventually realized was that it was an accidental phrase in a UK press release. And when I called the guy who runs the NGO in the UK, he explained the entire paradigm to me in that, you know, they've had to do a huge amount of work lobbying with government and pharmaceutical companies in the rare disease space to develop the appropriate policy framework that would allow government to take on these treatments. And in the UK, people with SMA were getting compassionate use access to the treatment. And they used the phrase global compassionate use program kind of accidentally. And what we figured out painfully over the years is that there's no such thing as global compassionate use, even though the phrase gets used quite often. Rarely, compassionate use access will only open up in countries where the drug companies, where the pharmaceutical companies are confident that they will eventually get reimbursed by the funders. Then they will, in some instances, when there is an agreement in place, provide free access to the treatment until reimbursement is possible. But what we discovered in South Africa is that none of that applied to us, you know, and that it was a slip of the corporate tongue, really. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I just want to go back to that word you used, the thoughtlessness. But from my perspective, it's a little bit more than that. I mean, where does the fault lie with the lack of treatment access here in South Africa? Is it the high price of the drugs? Because these drugs are enormously expensive.
Yeah.
Is it the private health funders, the medical aids that don't want to put these drugs on the prescribed minimum benefits list? Or is it government that's, you know, the whole system is just inadequate? Or is it all of the above?
I think it's a mix of everything. You know, if you take the drug Zolgensma, which is the drug offered by Novartis, which is, their list price is $2.1 million for a single injection. You know, Novartis bought that treatment, which was previously known as Avexis, from the producers, from the researchers for $8 billion something US. And while in the future, Novartis and all other pharmaceutical companies are going to have a broad array of these genetic drugs, at the moment, the SMA treatment is one of the few, you know. And so it seems to me like they're trying to recoup the capital outlay of this enormous purchase with the list price of a particular drug for a particular condition. And one can argue about the ethics of that, you know, till the cows come home. But what it means is that the funders, the government and medical aids in South Africa have to grapple with the idea of paying $2.1 million for a single patient. And when it comes to kind of how can you spend your money as a government funder or as a private medical scheme, that may not be sustainable, you know, if you want to keep your big glass offices, et cetera, or it just actually may not be sustainable. Bottom line, it may collapse the medical scheme. Those things are all debatable. But what we do know is that, you know, the cost calculations and the financial capability of funders are fundamentally different in the West and the rest. And so because the business model is ticking along well in the West, I don't get a sense from pharmaceutical companies in general, the ones that are charging these high prices or seeking these high prices, that they're that interested at this stage in the third world business model, you know. And so the negotiation for them is not a matter of extreme importance at the moment. And then from our perspective, our medical aid companies and government, it's not a matter of huge importance to them either. You know, they would like to kick the can down the road and avoid paying $2.1 million for a single patient as long as they can at the commercial level. And so you've got these clashing, quite profoundly clashing interests, you know. And then in South Africa, we've also got this new paradigm of NHI, the National Health Insurance, this idea that we're going to develop a new way of approaching healthcare between private and public. But it's not meant, you know, NHI never actually steps forward and takes shape, even though it's a theory. And so we're stuck in this theoretical landscape where we would like to treat payment for medicines in a completely different way, but we're not yet. We've quite harshly divided between public and private healthcare. And so we're stuck in this abstract kind of theoretical space. Yeah, which means that the drag seems to even grow rather than anything else with regards to these things.
But with my disease, I've also realized, and I saw you mention it as well, is there's a focus on chronic issues, right?
Yeah.
Or chronic treatment, but there's also a focus of what I've realized on not a lot on preventative. It must be acute. So it has to be, so when it's on the PMB list, it has to be chronic. It must be acute. But with these diseases, there's a whole different paradigm, right? There's a whole different way of looking at it.
Yeah, yeah, and I mean it's a very complicated space, and you know I think what I've picked up is that in the West, where there's strong diagnostic capacity, and the strong diagnostic capacity creates large patient advocacy groups. And large patient advocacy groups form the key pivot point between the pharmaceutical companies and the funders. And they're the ones who push this thing forward, and they've got a loud voice. And what I see locally is that we don't have that. So what patient advocacy we do have, the voice is mouse-like and very low. And so we don't have the impetus to drive government, medical aids and pharmaceutical companies to the negotiating table. Yeah.
Well, there's the negotiation, the bargaining power that they've got is so much more. These are multinational companies. These are a government, and you know it has a government who has a military, right? Just to put that into perspective, in terms of power, and then there's the medical aid companies also who are also large corporates. We've got small groups, as you said, and NPOs who are underfunded, who don't have the medical expertise sitting. I mean, they might have a few, but if you look at what's going on in America with the limb-girdle muscular dystrophy foundations, the Speak Foundation, the Jane Foundation, these are massive organizations or quite large organizations that are being funded by the American public for it. And the Muscular Dystrophy Association is being funded mostly, I would imagine, by government. So, and they all work together. But we don't have that. I mean, the Muscular Dystrophy Foundation of South Africa is doing great work. It's just that they don't have the resources and the same, expertise that people overseas have. And that is what we need. If you have to deal with these very difficult concepts in genetic research, and also you have to have clout, right? You have to sit around a table with the executives of a company and be heard, and also tell them what we as the patients want.
And so what I agree 100%. And what I've picked up very strongly in all the interviews I've done with all the stakeholders is that every single one of them has called explicitly and quite vigorously for much stronger collaboration, much stronger engagement. We need to work together. We need to sort this out, et cetera, et cetera. But what you don't see is any of those stakeholders leading the way. You know, and so there's a tendency for the head of XYZ to sit and have this conversation in very generous sort of philosophical terms, whilst quietly pointing the finger at the other party. Government do it, medical aids do it, the pharmaceutical companies do it. And so the result of that is that there's no arrowhead to this at all. There's just this, in my understanding, there's a glacially slow process where no one seems to have the imperative to lead it forward because everyone's interests are kind of pushed in another direction, you know. And it all remains a very abstract concept until treatments come out for other conditions where there are more people affected. And then what we're going to find is that we're way behind the game and that those patient groups are also going to be forced to wait 5, 10, 15 years before they get access to treatments that everyone else in the West is getting, unless we change what's going on. Yeah.
Do you know how many South Africans have rare diseases?
My understanding is 1 in 15 will be affected in their lifetime. So that would amount
to a lot.
It's 4.1 million people. Yeah, you know, so it's actually rare diseases are not as rare as they sound. Yeah, but the problem again is until treatments come out for a rare disease with a bigger profile, this is a very abstract idea to most people. It matters to me because I want that stuff for my muscles and my body. It doesn't matter.
The juice.
I want the juice. It clearly doesn't matter to other people in the way it matters to me. You know.
But there's also an issue of getting tested. In my case, for instance, I lived with a different disease for 8 years.
Yeah.
And then I lived with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy without a phenotype specific diagnosis. So I only know what I'm living with really from 2017. And I've been living with this disease, the symptoms since the 90s.
Yeah.
So there's this whole thing of genetic testing is extremely important so that people can get the exact diagnosis of what they have. And that's the starting point of all of this. If you know what you've got and we can all stand together, then we have a voice and then we can start negotiating with the other stakeholders.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And, you know, as we know in South Africa, our genetic testing is close to non-existent at this stage. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, as someone with limb-girdle muscular dystrophy, I see what's happening with the SMA community, and I can't help but think that it's going to happen again. You know, what can we do? You've now said that, look, no one's from the other stakeholders are really taking up the baton, they're taking up the fight. So what do you think we can do other than what we are trying to do with the Muscular Dystrophy Foundation of South Africa right now?
Well, I think there's two things. The one, I believe, is conversations exactly like this, in order to understand what the actual requirement is. Because until we get our language right, until we articulate the challenge properly, we are not going to succeed. And what I've seen through the last year or two is a profound lack of commonly understood language, you know. And so I think these conversations are extremely important because they establish a common language set. And once you've got that, you can move forward. And we don't have that yet. We're getting there this year. We're starting to get there. But these conversations are very important for that reason. We need to get our language much better in order to know what we're aiming for. And then we need to raise publicity without trying to go for the hype and shame. And, you know, I don't believe that there's any return for anyone exposing the terrible company, the terrible medical aid, the terrible government. That kind of journalism can be self-defeating, but we still need to raise this issue properly in the public space so that people become much more aware of what the implications are going to be for the whole country in the next 10 or 15 years. Once we get our language right, I believe we can start to do that. But the first step is to start to get our language much more coherent in terms of what these actual challenges are. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Andrew. I think we made it in time.
We're going to sneak in.
Just in time. But I think we should have more of these conversations going forward, really.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And you know, they're going to cut us any second, but I do believe while there are many issues, we must also recognize that even in the last year, our community has taken a lot of strides forward in terms of understanding what's going on and starting to mobilize in the right way. So we should never lose sight of what we've achieved. because we're in a much better condition now than we were 18 months ago, for sure. And so that's important too, is we're starting to take the right steps. Now we need to take them more aggressively.
Great. Thanks, Andrew.
Magic. Thanks, Marinus. We will talk again.
Okay.